Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on basic networking fundamentals. Now, in this lesson, I will tell you, well, just like the title says, this is going to be very basic networking fundamentals, or really just kind of the foundation of everything else that we're going to cover in this course. So you might actually feel as we go through this lesson like I'm teasing you, like I might just give you just a little tidbit of information, just enough to kind of salivate your mouth and be like, oh, okay, now I want to know about that. Just in time for me to say, but that's all I'm going to give you right now. And why am I doing that? Well, I like to be mean. No, all kidding aside, the reason I'm doing that is because I need to give you these little tidbits of information so that you can have them in the back of your mind as you learn the details of these different technologies as we go through the course. Okay, there's a lot of these technologies that rely on one another, and so there's kind of that dilemma of how do I learn this when I need to learn this first, but in order to learn this, I have to learn this first. Okay, so I'm going to give you all these small little pieces of all the different technologies so that it will allow you to really get it all to soak in as we go through the rest of the course. So that said, let's go ahead and get started. So to get things started, well, the first thing we need to do is, let's be real. We need to talk about what is a network. Well, a network is created when you have two or more hosts connected together so they can communicate and share resources. Now that was boring, right? Reading some words on a screen to you. Well, I want you to look at those words on the screen, and I actually want you to focus in on two of those words. And the two words we're going to talk about here are hosts and resources. Okay, these are two terms that you need to have a good, solid understanding sometimes referred to as a work group network. Matter of fact, in Microsoft world, it's literally called domain or work group. In that work group environment, this would be like your home or very small network. You don't have any administrators. You're not logging into a domain. You may be logging onto the individual computer just for security purposes, but each and every computer at home, for instance, has its own resources, and those resources can be shared with other computers in the home. Now, there are some other types of networks that are a little bit different than client-server and peer-to-peer, and they are something called LANs, CANs, MANs, and WANs. Or I really could simplify this, and I could just say LANs and WANs. Those are the two terms that you would probably be most familiar with. These are the two most common terms. But we're going to talk about all four of them here. Even though CANs and MANs aren't really used that much anymore, I want you to have an understanding of the history behind this. So first of all, let's start off with the LAN, which stands for Local Area Network. And it means just that. It's a very localized network. The problem that a lot of people run into is, well, what defines localized? Does local mean it is within a room? Does it mean it's within the floor of a building? Does it mean it's within the building? Does it mean it's within the company? What does localized mean? And I will tell you that there is no specific answer to that. What I can tell you is that most typically it's referred to as within the building. And the only place where that gets confusing is when you run into a situation where multiple companies share a building. Then you get my company's LAN versus your company's LAN. So you have multiple LANs within the building. But if you think of it as your company's network within a single building, that is a very simple definition of a LAN. Now let's grow from here. And the first place we can grow to would be a CAN, which stands for Campus Area Network. With a campus area network, you are now extending the network to multiple buildings, but to be specific, you are extending it to multiple contiguous buildings. Or in some cases, it's looked at as multiple buildings which exist on a single property. And if you think of the definition of a campus, or even if you get about the literal definition of a campus, think of where you hear the term campus. Usually it's either a very large business complex, right? You have a property that has a lot of buildings on it and it's all the same company, or a school. Very often at schools, at colleges, right? It'll be one big property, but you have all the different buildings. Those are a campus. So a campus area network is just that. It's a network that extends to all those buildings on that same property. Now, growing our network from there, we go into a MAN, a metropolitan area network. Now, I will tell you that this is a term that, of everything that we're going to go over in this entire lesson, is the least used term by today's standards. And once I explain exactly what it is, I'll explain why we don't use the term very much anymore. A metropolitan area network is where we extend our network out to multiple buildings, so we'll say multiple locations, but still contained within a metropolitan area. The problem is there's, once again, some gray area on what defines a metropolitan area. Now, there's a number of different definitions that I have heard over the years. One definition is that it's within a 100-kilometer radius. That would make it within a metropolitan area. I've heard people talk about, well, if it's near a big city. All right, so I happen to live near Chicago, so if you're within Chicago or the surrounding suburbs, you're within the Chicago metropolitan area. And another definition, and this is the one that really was the main reason we had this term, and also why we don't currently use the term really that much anymore, is if you are within a local calling area. And depending on how old you are, you may not even know what that statement means, local calling area. And that's why we don't use this term very much. Back in the day, when connectivity was all done between locations with dial-up modems, where you literally had to dial a phone number to make that connection, defining that something stayed within a metropolitan area was also stating that we would not incur any long-distance charges from the phone company. These days, there's two reasons that that's not really so much an issue anymore. Number one, calling plans very often just incorporate local and long-distance calling, and that's not really an issue. But the second reason, and much more importantly, is, well, we're not using dial-up modems anymore. Now, everything is done through direct connectivity and high-speed connectivity via the internet. But that's something we'll get into later on. And where we can grow our network from here is really kind of the end-all, be-all of all of this, which is growing it all the way to a WAN, or wide area network. And you may remember when I started this whole series of LANs, CANs, MANs, and WANs, as I said, we could just simplify this with LANs and WANs, right? You're either local or you're wide. And local means you're localized, you're within the building, and wide means you're expanding out of the building. We don't really look at the CANs and MANs too much anymore. But if we did still take those into consideration, where do we define that we've moved out into a wide area network? Well, it means if we are in multiple locations that are not contained within a single metropolitan area. So the example I have on the screen shows offices in 5 different cities around the United States. In this environment, this would be what we would call a WAN, a wide area network. And again, I just want to re-emphasize that in today's world, for the most part, you'll hear people talk about LANs and WANs, and you can get away with just knowing what those are. And if you ever see, let's say, a job posting, maybe you're looking for a job and you see LAN administrator or you see WAN administrator, all you're really seeing is LAN administrator means you're going to work within a building, right? So it's going to be either a smaller company or maybe you're just going to do the one component of that company. Whereas a WAN administrator, you're going to be working with multiple locations, making connectivity from one city to another. Now, the next basic networking fundamental that I want to discuss with you is the idea behind how do we get data from a computer over here to a computer over here, right? I mean, how does that happen, right? We know that we have multiple computers on a network, but how does the data get from one place to another? And this is something called network media. Now, one thing that I really need to emphasize here, if we're going to talk about network media, is, real quick, people when they think of network media, they think of cables, right? We have a computer over here, and then we take this cable and we run it over here to the computer over here, and, well, now they're connected. Well, believe it or not, these days, the network media might just be the air around us. It may be invisible to the naked eye. Okay, it could be what's called wireless network media. Okay, and we'll talk about both wired and wireless network media in more detail as we get later on in the course. Okay, but just real quick here to give you kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. I have here one of the most typical network cables that is used in today's, well, at least office networks. Okay, it happens to be a Cat5 twisted pair cable. Some people call it an Ethernet cable. I don't want to get into the details of that right now, but it's just kind of the idea that, well, here's a cable, right? That's the obvious. But what I also have over here is a wireless router. Now, just because I'm showing you a picture of a wireless router, it's really not truly showing you that we're using the invisible airways. But notice that it's this box that has a couple of antennas on it. And that's what those antennas are for. It's for sending and receiving data through the airways. All right, so you need to understand that network media can be physical cable, or it could just be the air around us. Now I want you to become familiar with a term that is used heavily when it comes to computer networking. And that term is protocol. A protocol, by definition, is a set of rules and procedures for communication. Now, what does that mean to computer networking? Well, in order for hosts or computers to communicate on a network, they must phone to your phone, right? We do that with a phone number. Believe it or not, a phone number is a form of address. Or I have one for you. How about the postal network? Right? The postal network is a great example to use when trying to think of how addressing works because, well, we use the same terminology. If I want to send you a letter, in order for that letter to get to you, I have to put an address on the envelope. And I will also tell you, and you'll see this in much more detail when we get to the various lessons on TCP/IP and IP addressing, you'll see that the addressing and the way it works with the postal network, where you have a breakdown of that address, right? You have the name and you have the street number and street name and city and state and zip code and country if it's international. You have all the different components of the address. Well, that's how IP addresses work as well, believe it or not. You may see it as just a bunch of numbers, but there is actually a breakdown, and we're going to learn all about that when we get later on in this course. Now, that does bring us to the end of this lesson, and again, I just kind of want to re-emphasize, because if you're feeling very teased right now, that's okay, because The whole point behind this lesson was just to give you some very basic foundational information, just so you can keep it in the back of your mind, so that as I go into more detail on some of these specific technologies and concepts, you'll hopefully be able to grasp hold of them in a much better way than you would have if I just kind of jumped right into them. All right, so that is all I have for you when it comes to basic networking fundamentals, and I will see you in the next lesson.